So bad news is, I think for the Heritage Game section, which is what we have now, I think we have lost a speaker. If there is a speaker for this session, could
we have Hugh here?
Yes. No, I didn't think so. So what we are going to do, and here is the partially good news, is we'll have 2 speakers for the Heritage Game session, and then we'll have Q&A, and then we'll start the next session 15 minutes earlier, if that's all right with everyone. That's right with everyone? And we'll tell, if you can tell people in Discord and Zoom, etc. Yes, we're going to have the break 15 minutes earlier, and I believe it will be out there. Oh no, there's no break, is there? Oh, cool. It's just your mind. So this is the session for Heritage Games. First up, we have Hugh Davies from RMIT and Chinese DiGRA. Away you go, sir.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, thank you, Erik. I'm Hugh Davies. I'm a scholar based largely at RMIT in Melbourne, and I'm president of the Chinese Digital Games Research Association. So yeah, hopefully this will be fairly quick, but I have far too many slides and I'm controlling 2 things at once, so we're probably going to get a bit lost and confused, or at least I am. In this presentation, I want to explore under-discussed aspects of the Chinese game development sector by using Black Myth Wukong as an example. So I want to do this because a large area of my current research concerns Chinese game studies, and also because many articles and headlines about Black Myth Wukong have brought more confusion than clarity to the Chinese game sector and those working within it. Media outlets have asked whether Wukong is woke or anti-feminist, is indie or AAA, if the game is a soft power move with concerning geopolitical and military implications. All of these, I argue, reflect more local anxieties and sadly tell us little to nothing about the game or the conditions of its production. So let's begin with some sort of basic agreed upon facts about Black Myth Wukong. It's a 2024 action role-playing game developed by a Hangzhou-based independent studio, Game Science. It's inspired by the classic Chinese novel Journey to the West from the sort of turn of the 15th, 16th century. Launched to an enthusiastic reception in August 2024, breaking record sales. And then from this, I want to tackle 3 questions or kind of points of confusion. Specifically, having made a AAA game with Tencent, the largest game company in the world, how is Game Science an independent? And how was this game that plays with Chinese history and mythology and features extensive violence, published within China's notoriously strict video game regulation environment? And finally, what can we learn from this that can be applied in the Australian setting? So to begin with, we should tackle these questions. Well, these questions require some context. So importantly, the familiar dynamic between well-funded blockbuster AAA games and the more creatively experimental indie games that we're all very familiar with is incorrectly applied to Chinese games and makers. In China, AAA games and indie games are set in opposition not to each other, but typically to Chinese-style online games or domestic games, while game journalism in the West is yet to sort of clearly articulate this distinction. It's well recognised by Chinese game scholars who discuss the addictive qualities of these Chinese-style online games, various international laws that attempt or fail to do the same thing as the Chinese government, basically to try and stop video games becoming sort of casinos where players lose a lot of money. You can see Tian Yi's work earlier in today discussing these things, as well as a few local scholars. It's not a level of nuance that really makes the Australian media, unfortunately. In my own research among Chinese game developers, these predatory game types were called capital games, as opposed to the more creative and expressive original games. The Chinese indie developers I spoke with were incredibly scathing of what they called capital games, highlighting their abusive relationship between game companies and their consumers. It's worth noting that 15 years before launching Black Myth Wukong, one of the founders of Game Science, Feng Li, wrote, well, a few kind of manifestos, but in one of them really decrying capital games for keeping players addicted, rinsing them of their money, and basically making them hate each other as a community. Conversely, most of the Chinese independent game developers I spoke with really want to make and promote original games, so games as expressive cultural objects and artifacts that are focused on quality over financial imperatives. The biggest complaint about capital games that I heard was that they dictate the mainstream perception of all video games in China as games as sort of corrupting and addictive products. And in response to this, the CCP government blanket restricts all games, whether they be made by like tech colossus like Tencent or NetEase, or just a two-person indie operation. So understandably, many Chinese indie developers perceive themselves as caught in a monumental battle between local and international media misrepresentations, CCP government regulations, and competition from capital games and their makers. These severe government restrictions really came to a head in 2018 with a total ban on publishing games in China. This cost billions of yuan and bankrupted many developers and saw companies like Tencent just hemorrhaging money for almost a year. Yet talking to the Chinese game developers I spoke with at this time, much of this research took place during 2018 in China. So many defended the CCP's socialist impulse to combat capital game production and monetization. State restrictions were understood as a blunt instrument, but also a benevolent socialist impulse. To curtail neoliberal game experiences that are designed to generate profit by whatever means necessary. So returning to this sort of schema, these sentiments were proven during the 2018 publishing ban when Chinese indie game developers and large companies like Tencent and the Chinese government kind of joined forces to redefine the perception of games in China. And they did this via a twin strategy of promoting original games and functional games. Now, I've already kind of discussed what original games are, games sort of made for originality over emulation, as creative expression over pure profit. Functional games is a term that really sort of emerged during this period in 2018. So functional games are kind of like serious games, what we call serious games, but with the aim specifically of teaching traditional Chinese values, culture, and heritage. So to promote these game types, developers set up an educative exhibition of original and functional games at the Central Academy of Art in Beijing, underscoring these games as artistic practice. A book was released about functional games, an international conference on functional games was held, and a whole lot of articles were published about functional games. Now, this strategy kind of worked, and partly because the government itself was involved. It brought about a major shift in the mainstream thinking about games in China. Game publication was reinstated in 2019, and regulation switched focus to really sort of focus on younger people. This is where the sort of like the very intense bans on younger players came in to try and protect them, particularly from predatory sort of capital games. Perhaps most notably, CCP members began to take much more nuanced understandings of the game sector and its output. Now, despite this sort of monumental shift, it's really one of the largest in sort of like game production history in terms of finances and people involved. Almost nothing appears about it in online in English. When I search, one of the few things that came up is my own recent paper discussing it. But if you search functional games in simplified Chinese, a whole lot of articles which you can have translated in your browser appear. Now, having run out of time just sort of providing basic context for all of this, I'm going to address the first and the second questions now as quickly as I can. So basically, how can game science be described as an indie? Because basically indie and AAA are not seen as radically different in mainland China as compared with Chinese-style online games or gambling, loot box games, however you want to describe them. And the other thing is Tencent only bought a non-controlling 5% of game science in 2018. And number two, how was this game even published within China's notoriously strict regulation environment? Because it was framed as both an original and a functional game. And they achieved this because Journey to the West and the Chinese classic on which Black Myth Wukong is based has been transmediated across Asia for almost 500 years in books, paintings, theatre, song, poetry, more recently in cinema, TV, games, and even drones. And the story of the Monkey King enjoys enormous popularity comparable to, say, Tolkien or Star Wars in English. In fact, at the time of Black Myth Wukong's release last year, the top 3 Chinese mobile games were all based on or inspired by Journey to the West. But crucially, Journey to the West is a story that celebrates Chinese history and culture, making it perfect material for a functional game. You can visit key heritage locations in the game, highlighting China's rich cultural past, and develop awareness of Chinese values along Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian trajectories. This international influence of Black Myth Wukong has also drawn the suspicion of Western media, not just of sort of cultural and soft power of China, but also of China's technology development. Again, a little bit of context is required. Chinese gaming has long been dominated by the affordable and accessible mobile platform. Today, 1/3 of China's population plays mobile games, which is sort of roughly around 500 million people. But for the first time in history, Chinese game players are buying powerful desktop computers specifically to play Black Myth Wukong. So this is largely about a rising middle class, indeed the world's largest middle class, and the national pride in China's first AAA game. But of course, this has widely been interpreted by Western media as a front in the sort of China-US technology chip war. So to conclude, what lessons can be applied in the Australian setting? So first, basically just Chinese game culture has its own unique barriers, histories, terminologies, anxieties, very different to those in the West. As the largest site of games production and consumption in the world, I really think it's worth developing an understanding of Chinese game development culture. But to do that, you can't really believe what you're reading in the Anglophone outlets about in relation to Chinese games. It's just the nature of contemporary journalism on a place like China. It's a bit too clickbaity. It usually speaks more about local anxieties and issues than what's going on in China. Instead, I recommend tuning into Chinese outlets, even the state media such as China Daily and Xinhua, which at least provide direct information on the Chinese government and openly announce themselves as propaganda outlets. And also a whole lot of game outlets as well. There's a lot of places where you can get good information on Chinese games. And not least at all, like most of the stuff that I discuss here comes from this article, which I published last year in a collection in Media International, co-curated by Brendan Keogh. And look more broadly at the work of Chinese game scholars to learn about and even contribute to this enormous area of games research. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. There's going to be now the presentation. Here's a PhD student in Canada and Concordia University. Okay, so Poki Chan is the next speaker by video, and she is a PhD student at Concordia.
Hello, my name is Poki Chan. I'm a PhD student from Concordia University, and my research interest lies in digital cultural heritage and game studies. My research focuses on how virtual environments shape our understanding of history and memory. Today, I want to talk about how games don't just reflect history, they shape how we remember it. And one of the best examples is the Kowloon City, a place that no longer exists in reality but is widely recognized in movies, games, and digital media. The questions I want to explore today is how can virtual heritage games provide a counter-narrative to the aestheticized versions of history that dominate popular culture? Look at these images. They may all look real, but in fact, not all of them are real. Some are game screenshots, AI-generated images, or 3D renders. Most people today recognize the Kowloon City not from history books, but from games and movies, and this brings up an issue. The real walled city was not a cyberpunk dystopia. It was a dense but functioning community where people lived and worked. However, because it was demolished in 1993, it has now been replaced by digital representations, and in many cases, these digital versions have become more real than history itself. It leads to my key question. How do virtual heritage games offer an alternative way to think about history? And before we explore that, let's first understand how the walled city has become one of the most misrepresented places in global media. French philosopher Jean Baudrillard introduced simulacra and simulation in 1994, arguing that copies of realities can replace the original so completely that the real thing is forgotten. In the case of Kowloon City, the digital version replaces the real history, distorting public perception. Most people today know the walled city only through its fictionalized cyberpunk version, not the historical records. And these digital reconstructions, such as Stray, reinforce stereotypes instead of challenging them. The more people see these fictional versions, the more they believe them to be real, and this process is shaped by Orientalism and seriality. The Kowloon City is not just randomly designed in games. It has been shaped by a larger narrative of Asianness. Edward Said's Orientalism explains how the West often depicts Asia as mystical, chaotic, and lawless. So you can see that the Kowloon City is turned into a cyberpunk dystopia and exotic, lawless playground for players. While Iwabuchi's Orientalism shows that even Asian games developers reinforce these stereotypes to fit global market expectations. For example, the Paranormal Hong Kong is made by a Hong Kong game studio, and it mixes the real Hong Kong culture with horror and crime stereotypes because that is what players expect. According to the research work I did for my games and research, the former residents described the Kowloon City actually as a close-knit community with strong informal economies. The real Kowloon City was not neon lights and crimes as many people would assume. They described the Kowloon City was their home, and even though it was not a perfect place to live. So why do we keep seeing this same stereotypes? This is where Jamie's discussions on serializing Asianness at Chinese DiGRA last year becomes important. She explains how games make Asianness into something familiar and recognizable for players. Jason Cole's Zero-reality shows that games don't create new depictions, they copy old ones. We can see that from Ghost in the Shell to Stranger Hall to Sleeping Dogs to Cyberpunk 2077, each version moves further away from reality. Now, let's talk about what's missing in these digital representations of the walled city. We have seen how games recycle aestheticized versions of Hong Kong, but they rarely capture the lived experience of the people who were actually there. So Champion's cultural presence explain these gaps in two ways, Attic cultural presence and Emic cultural presence. So Attic cultural presence is when history is seen from the outside as something to observe, like a museum or a documentary, while Emic cultural presence is when history is experienced from within as something lived, where players don't just see history but feel being in it. Cultural presence is not a tool. It is something that emerges when designers deeply engage with historical narratives and lived experience. But how do we achieve that? This is where diaspora memory becomes crucial, in my opinion. Diaspora communities are not passive observers of history. They actively preserve, interpret, and reconstruct cultural memory. It is a fact that many Hong Kongers in the diaspora have lived through significant historical events, whether it's political movements, social transitions, or the loss of physical places like Kowloon City. However, the memory are often displaced or erased in mainstream media and games, which tend to focus on simplified, aestheticized versions of Hong Kong history that fit pre-existing cyberpunk and crime stereotypes. But diaspora memory is not just longing for the past, it is a way of negotiating cultural identity across time and space. And one of the most effective ways to capture diaspora memory is through oral history. So how do we make sure that diaspora voices are heard and that history is not just retold but meaningfully engaged with? So oral history provides access to the lived experience of historical spaces. Michael Fridge's shared authority argues that history should not just be told about people, but it should be told with and by them. This means that instead of relying on external interpretations of history, we need to work directly with people who lived through it so they can actively shape cultural memory. Diaspora, when incorporated through oral history, offers an alternative to serialized cyberpunk nostalgia. But for oral history to be meaningful, games cannot just use it as a background information. It needs to shape the way players interact with the world, like allowing players to experience decision-making, social structures, live inside the Kowloon city. So at this point, I would position virtual heritage games not as a fixed solution, but as a space for reflection and historical engagement. For conclusion, back to the question I asked in the very beginning, how can virtual heritage games provide a counter-narrative to the aestheticized versions of history that dominate popular culture? In other words, it means how we move beyond aesthetic nostalgia and engage meaningfully with history. I argue that it will be achieved by integrating diaspora perspective, oral history, and thoughtful interaction design. We can create meaningful digital representations. Virtual heritage games, when grounded in research and community collaborations, offer a counter-narrative by challenging aesthetics, nostalgia, and encouraging deeper engagement with history. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you for making this far.
Yeah, I've just got it on. That's right.
Okay, thank you very much. I have two questions actually. One's for Dr. Hugh and one's for Poki. My question for Dr. Hugh is about what do you think the Chinese reception of Black Myth Wukong, considering that the game does not only represent but also in some way deconstruct the the story of the journey to the West in ways that some characters might not act in the way of the original depictions. Does the government, the Chinese media have problem with that? And I think for Poki, my question will be something along, I think it's interesting that you mentioned Kowloon's Gate, because the gameplay of Kowloon's Gate is a little bit different. It's less action oriented. It's more like a point and click, like a virtual, like an interactive storytelling of some sorts. My question is that does the gameplay of Kowloon's Gate come from a Hong Kong or maybe a Chinese literature traditions or storytelling traditions in a way that perhaps it gives more authenticity to the depictions of the Kowloon walled city? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hario. So I have to sort of begin by saying, you know, like I'm discussing a game that has been played by millions and millions, or half a billion people potentially. So sweeping generalizations with everything that I say in terms of like how people have responded to it. I guess the key thing to note is that even though Journey to the West is sort of, you know, one of the 5 classic Chinese novels, most people are most familiar with the story through popular culture, which is not to say that, like, you know, they haven't read it or engaged with it at some point in school or whatever, but that so much of how that story is transmediated really takes over the other interpretations. So within that context, I think the government is a little bit, not hamstrung, but it's that thing of like, well, if we regulate this, where do we stop? Because there are so many different versions of the game and there are so many characters, so many versions of the text, and there are so many characters in other games and in other texts that are very heavily influenced. So I think that if you compare it to a game like 100 Seasons of Jingyang, or Canal Towns, I think it's known in the West, which was a game set in the Ming Dynasty that did similar stuff in that it re-evoked Chinese history within a game context, and it sort of played a little bit with the time, got sort of, you know, controversial figures from various points in history and crammed them all into the text, and some of the representation of those characters drew some controversy from the government. Black Myth Wukong hasn't received that sort of close scrutiny. So does that answer your question? Yes. Was that the only question you had for me? Yes. Yes, great. Okay, over to you, Poki.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to clarify, I will need your clarifications on your questions. Are you asking that the interaction, right, the point and click and the act like scenarios, for example, like storytelling from show, actually adds authenticity to the depictions of the Kowloon Wall City? Is that your question?
Yes, that's correct, Poki. Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't think about that, but because my initial thought was like, it does not matter if it is like an action game or if it's a point and click. I mean, look at the Taiwan independent game Detention, right? They are also like a point and click game. And I think like feng shui and storytelling, like fortune telling, right? They're like it is more like a Asian culture that exists everywhere. So the point and click or action or the culture that features in the game alone, then they alone do not really as the authenticity about a place. I think what adds authenticity to a place that gives you a sense of being there is how things being embedded in incorporated together work as a game. Because when players experience a game, they do not the experience as an entirety, as an whole experience, instead of identifying parts by parts. So yeah, in my opinion, I do not think that having culture like storytelling or fortune telling feng shui would add the authenticity to a place. It might help if it fits the storytelling. I mean the game narrative. And yeah, if that answer your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Poki.
Thank you.
We can't hear you.
Okay,
Yes.
so sorry for fighting the mic over Brandon, but like I got ask you a question. First of all, both great presentation for the panel, but I have to ask a question for you because I'm such a huge fan of the game. But I can talk the game for an hour basically. But like I got a question recently, and that's I kind of want to leverage your knowledge about the game production in China. Do you think Black Myth Wukong is like the start, like the dawn of the Chinese AAA industry, or it's just like a ephemeral miracle that only happened once?
That's what everyone is asking at the moment. That's one of the few points of agreement in terms of a question that I hear both sort of from people in China and from media outside of China. Is this the beginning of China's significant AAA sector producing sort of PC games, or is this just a one-off? And I've heard sort of both sides of it. I know that there's going to be some sort of a sequel. I know that Game Science is, as I'm sure you do as well, that there's some sort of sequel in the works. I know that there's a couple of other companies who've gone, wow, like we can totally do this. We now have the developers and we have the technology and we have, because of course, you know, for so long, everyone's just been making, you know, kind of gacha games on mobile and that sort of thing. And now suddenly it's like, oh, wow, you can produce this like grand scale blockbuster game and it's going to do really well. So for me, the answer is I don't really know, but the impact that the game has had is so profound that where if you'd asked me the week that the game had launched, I would have said, no, this is probably a one-off. And now I'm like, actually, I don't think it will be a one-off. I don't know if it's going to explode a AAA kind of gaming sector in China, but yeah, definitely there will be other AAA games, I think.
Thank you.
My question was also for Hugh, so someone had a Poki question, please jump in instead.
Oh, yes, excellent.
Thanks. Great panel. My question is for Poki Chan as well. It's quite funny, really. Over Christmas, I watched Twilight of the Warriors Walled In. It's a 2024 movie, all entirely set around the walled city. And I guess my first question is, was that an authentic representation of the place? The second one is, though, that you said that it's often depicted as lawless and chaotic. But then it actually had a strong sense of community, informal economies, and social order. That actually did come through in the movie for me. So even though it was incredibly lawless and chaotic, the second part really did kind of celebrate the second part as well in a really kind of interesting, sort of melancholic, subtle way. I think they were thinking about it wasn't a revisionist history as much as it was a meditation on how things used to be, but of course drummed up for cinema. Anyway, I wanted to ask you about your comments on the movie, if you've seen it, and how that falls within the sort of the interstices of the arguments you're making. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. I also watched the movie. Yeah, I definitely think that the art is brilliant. They do kind of do the whole set, like visualize the whole set in 3D from, because I only see the pictures from the book, the City of Darkness, and they do have everything built up in set, like the salon and the place where you the tutorial make fish balls, and also the home that you can see a hole in the ceiling. I do ask my mom if that's really the design of the colonoscopy, and she said no, it's because it's like it's illegally constructed, and people do not like have very strict regulations when they build a thing. So the ceiling collapsed and there's a hole. It is not designed. So it's funny. And this movie also, it triggered a lot of conversations within the family. It is like, for me, is more like a trigger to trigger for having a conversation about like how life looks like when it is in the past. But like on the other hand, it is a movie, so it is, and you know that our everyday life is not that dramatic enough to be featured on a movie that make money. So for being a movie, it has a lot of dramatic sections. Like I remember there is a guy, he has some qigong, and then you poke him with a lot of knife, and he's still like, yeah, I'm okay. It's not true. And not everyone in the Wall City knows Kung Fu. Not even just alone the Barbara, they don't know Kung Fu. Yeah, so there is a lot of, some dramatic stuff in the movie. But it's true that, for example, like the mother of the child is a prostitute and she died for some reason. And I also read the newspaper from there is still a well-being community of the Kowloon city set in Huangtaixing in Hong Kong. And I borrowed the newspaper, and there is a newspaper saying that, okay, this baby girl has had both her parents died, and if anyone would like to help, just donate some money to help raise this girl. There is true stories like this, but it's not that dramatic, I guess. And it is also true that a lot of people without an identity card, they have to live in the Kowloon city because it's cheap. You don't need any identification in order to rent a place. I could always say that the movie is cool, and it builds up on like partially like real settings, but then you cannot really take it as like a authentic version. But we all expect that. So I think what I can comment on this movie in relation to my presentation is also part of the Asianness, the surreality of Asianness, that people sell this IP and kind of like strengthening the stereotype of a place that does not exist. And it's good that this place does not exist, so you cannot really, to verify if it's true. Everything is like mystery, and you can always have that fantasy. Does this answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks both. Really, really fascinating papers. It's probably quite similar to the previous question on Black Myth, but I think in a slightly different direction. The idea of capital games is really, really fascinating, and how AAA doesn't make sense in both different contexts. But in that way, where I guess in a Western context, we talk about Black Myth as like China's first AAA game, and where it's kind of been framed in a celebratory way like that. I guess I'm like curious. Just realized I don't have the question framed, damn it. But I guess I'm curious, like, what is the legitimizing power of like that label AAA, like that idea of like this Chinese company coming into the West and like, doing the AAA thing and like making a capital game that is perceivable as a AAA thing. I guess like, is either for the Chinese government or the Chinese game industry, is there like a strategically valuable thing there, like being able to be perceived as AAA, I guess? Does that make sense?
Yeah, this is something which I'm always sort of trying to get to the bottom of as well, because, and you know, that's very much my sort of, like my Western understanding of games and all that sort of thing, that, you know, like there is this kind of like, well, we've got AAA and then we've got independent, and they do bleed between each other, and a lot of sort of AAA developers make their own indie games. And of course, the same is in China. But with this sort of being kind of like the first, Black Myth Wukong being the first AAA game, and again, that's sort of contestable, but I guess the way that it's, the way that it seems to have been framed is that it's the first AAA game in China that isn't just sort of like riddled with loot boxes and gacha mechanics and that kind of thing. So there are high budget Chinese games, but they're kind of framed within this, what some of my interviewees called capital games. And yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one because this is sort of the unknown space. Like I've divided them as well as I can in that, yeah, indies and AAAs are sort of seen as well. Ultimately, when people are playing those games and when people are designing those games, they're designing them for player enjoyment and immersion. The idea, and I suppose the financial mechanics of it is key. So you buy the game outright and you're not paying to play. So this is why Steam has become such a sort of phenomenal thing in China, because what it signals is a different monetary model where you buy the game outright and you don't have to sort of shell out every time you want to get a new sword or whatever. So yeah, I'm a little bit lost in what I'm trying to say there, but yeah, I hope that kind of answers it a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you, Poki. Please stay online if you can. So the next session is also heritage games, but more to do with preservation. So the next session, if James and Larry could come up, I think you're next. And is Vincent in the room? Yes. Okay. Oh, okay. And Annika is just here. So, so the next talk, if you would like to come up, a Trans-Tasmanian Working Party. So James Manning from RMIT and Larry May from the University of Auckland, if I'm not wrong. It's yours.
We just have 2 minutes.
2 minutes?
1 minute?
Well, should we have another question?
What's that?
Time for one more question while they set up.
Did you have a question, Erik?
Yes, I have a couple of questions. So I don't know if Poki is still online, but in 2006, there was a conference in Hong Kong called New Heritage, where they talk about oral histories in Hong Kong, and the book is out by Routledge. So it was actually organized by the university there. And for you, I'm going to ask a question after this about transmedia and what version of the Journey to the West is actually in the game, because that's a very interesting question.